The United States as we know it began in the year 1776. That's the year on our money and on the Declaration of Independence. We had a centennial celebration in 1876, a bicentennial in 1976 where Queen Elizabeth danced with Gerald Ford, and we'll apparently have a semi-quincentennial in 2026. But it's not like American society just materialized out of thin air in 1776. The first permanent settlement by the English on what would become U.S. soil was 169 years prior, in 1607. So that would categorize over 40% of American history as prior to the Declaration of Independence. In today's video, we're going to be looking at some of the lesser known wars in American history, those that occurred prior to the American Revolution. A couple clarifiers have to be made here. The people that occupied the colonies prior to American independence didn't necessarily consider themselves Americans. It was a national identity that hadn't distinctly materialized yet. The closer we get to the Revolutionary War, the more of that identity begins to form. But keep in mind when I say Americans in this video, I'm referring to a very different America than the one that we know and love today. I'll often be using the word English or British if it takes place after 1707, or just New Englanders because a lot of these wars focus on New England specifically. The second thing I have to consider in this video is Native Americans. If I was making an exhaustive list on every war fought in American soil prior to 1776, I would have to include dozens, if not hundreds of conflicts between both Native American tribes and colonists, and between Native Americans and other Native Americans. Because most Native tribes in what became the USA didn't utilize a written language, many of these conflicts have unverifiable details or are just completely lost to history. So the criteria I'm going to use in this video when choosing which conflicts I discuss are going to be that the English or British American settlers must have been heavily involved in the war, and it has to be bigger in scale than a one-time skirmish between a community and their local Native American tribe. That being said, there will still be some wars that are left out in this video, but I'm going to try to cover all the major ground that I can. Hopefully that makes sense. Without further ado, let's start talking about the wars before the Revolution. The Pequot War was a conflict fought in early colonial America that can be viewed as a bad omen of how Native Americans would be handled by the colonists for hundreds of years of history to come. The Pequot in their prime controlled 250 square miles in southeastern Connecticut and had a population of roughly 8,000 spread between 15 to 20 villages. Sure, that doesn't sound like a whole lot by today's standards, but the colonist population of the entire 13 colonies in 1630 was about 4,200. The Connecticut River Valley was a pivotal route for wampum and fur trade at the time, and the area was completely under the control of the Pequot and Dutch colonists prior to the arrival of the English colonists. In summer of 1634, an English trader named John Stone was killed by the Pequot while traveling the Connecticut River, along with his crew. We don't know the exact reason why this happened, but the region and the Pequot were wildly unstable and vulnerable at the time. In the winter of 1633 to 1634, the Pequot population had halved due to a smallpox epidemic, and their system of governance was a tributary confederacy, meaning they had essentially gobbled up a bunch of smaller Native American nations through conquest, coercion, marriage, and/or diplomacy. As you can tell, tensions were already both high within the Pequot Confederacy and between them and their colonist neighbors. So when another successful English trader, John Oldham, was killed in Pequot territory in 1636, the colonists decided that it was time for retaliation. Do keep in mind that this is only one side of the story, and we can't really say for sure if there was equal or worse aggression by the English towards the Pequot prior to the beginning of the war. In August 1636, 90 men from Massachusetts Bay Colony set sail for Block Island, the site of Oldham's death. Their arrival marked the first recorded amphibious assault in the New World, led by Colonel John Endicott. The English burned several villages on Block Island, but there was no significant bloodshed. They returned to Saybrook Fort on the mainland and attempted negotiations with the Pequot in one of their major villages. These negotiations did not end up going too well. The English burned down the village, and the Pequot swiftly retaliated by besieging Saybrook Fort. The siege lasted almost 8 months, from September 1636 to April 1637, where English soldiers were killed or captured if they ventured too far from the fort, and Pequot warriors were attempting to cut off their supply lines and create alliances with other local tribes. This ended up backfiring on them though, because they attempted an alliance with the local Narragansett tribe, but they had a historic rivalry with the Pequot and joined the war on the side of the English. After an attack by the Pequot in April 1637, which captured 2 children and killed 9 adults, that resulted in Connecticut officially declaring war on the Pequot. A coalition of soldiers from Connecticut, Massachusetts Bay, the Mohegan and Narragansett tribes attacked the Pequot fortified village of Mystic. Once again, let me reiterate that though all these groups were involved, it was still a small-scale conflict compared to the bigger wars we think of in American history. This attacking force was only about 300 men. The force encircled the village, set it on fire, and shot anyone that tried to escape. Over 400 Pequot men, women, and children were killed. 7 were reported captured, and 7 escaped. This is referred to as the Massacre at Mystic. The English suffered severe severe casualties as well, but continued marching through Pequot territory, burning villages as they went and successfully defending against Pequot counterattacks. By early summer 1637, the Pequot had begun to abandon their territory and split into different groups, some of whom retreated and sought refuge with other local tribes, and some of who wanted to continue to fight the English. During the final major battle of the war, the Fairfield Swamp Fight, the English were hunting the Pequot sachem Sassacus. The Pequot decisively lost, suffering severe casualties and having the rest of the captured survivors sold into slavery. Sassacus attempted an escape but was killed, not by the English but by the Mohegan and Mohawk. What was left of the Pequot resistance crumbled after this point, and the Treaty of Hartford was signed on September 21st, 1638. This forced the Pequot to never return to their former territory, and the survivors were dispersed between the Mohegan and Narragansett, where they were no longer allowed to refer to themselves as Pequot, and so the Pequot War ended with a decisive English victory. 6 years after the Pequot War ended, 4 English colonies assembled a military alliance, fearing that future conflicts with the Native Americans was inevitable. Plymouth, Massachusetts Bay, Connecticut, and New Haven formed the New England Confederation, vowing to aid each other militarily if and when the next war began. And that day would arrive a generation later in 1675. The Wampanoag tribe, situated in modern-day southeastern Massachusetts, had a workable relationship with the English settlers in the area. They had entered a defensive agreement called the Wampanoag Treaty with Plymouth Colony in 1621, assuring their mutual protection and punishment of anyone who would break the peace. However, this treaty did not last forever. When Wampanoag sachem Massasoit died in 1661, his son Wamsutta filled the role, but was arrested less than a year later by the English on suspicion of plotting war. By the way, please forgive me if I pronounce any of these Native American names incorrectly. Wamsutta's younger brother Metacom, or Metacomet depending on the translation, became the next sachem, and understandably had a less favorable view towards the English than his father. Metacom was known as Philip to the English, as many natives began to take on English names during this time. By January of 1675, Metacom was ready for war. The murder of an English allied native by 3 Wampanoag men, most likely orchestrated by Metacom, ignited tensions between the Wampanoag and the English, and the stage was set for what would be known as King Philip's War, the deadliest conflict ever fought on American soil, with an estimated 30% of the native population losing their lives due to the fighting. The war officially began on June 20th, 1675, with the Wampanoag carrying out a series of raids in Swansea, Massachusetts. The allied factions of each side quickly escalated, with the native Nipmuc, Pecumtuck, and Narragansett tribes joining Metacom and the Wampanoag, and the Mohegan and Mohawk tribes siding with Plymouth and the rest of the New England Confederation. The Confederation itself declared war on Metacom and his allies on September 9th, with a massive ambush of 700 Nipmuc attacking a Confederation militia group the following week. In December, the Confederation retaliated. A massive raid on the Narragansett and Wampanoag in modern-day Rhode Island resulted in 300 natives dead and the rest of Metacom's forces retreating to New York. While in New York, Metacom sought the alliance of the Mohawk, but the Mohawk were hostile towards the Wampanoag and their allies, which forced them to retreat again back to New England. During the winter of 1675 to 1676, Metacom's warriors carried out various sporadic, unpredictable raids against the English colonies, including Plymouth Plantation and Providence, Rhode Island. The English were at a weak point, but this quickly changed when Canonchet, the chief of the Narragansett, was captured and killed. Canonchet was one of Metacom's most valuable assets, coordinating the hugely successful attack on the English by the Wampanoag. Things would only get worse for Metacom though, because in August of 1676, he was killed in combat. This effectively ended the war, with no central leadership among Metacom's coalition and the native population and resources significantly depleted. The surviving natives were either sold into slavery, allied themselves with the English, or were forced to retreat. Small skirmishes between Metacom's surviving allies and the English continued for 2 more years, but the Treaty of Casco was signed in 1678, ending King Philip's War officially. Unfortunately, this was far from the end of conflicts between the early English colonists and the local Native Americans, though. Some of these next wars I'm going to cover are classified as smaller parts of larger European conflicts. By this time in history, the colonies of the European great powers were growing large enough to become separate theaters themselves in the near constant conflicts that their mother continent engaged in. The first of these wars was King William's War, or as it's called globally, the 9 Years' War. I'm going to keep these European descriptions very bare bones, because this is a video about pre-revolutionary American wars, not European ones. So, in short, the 9 Years' War began with a coalition of forces called called the Grand Alliance in a power struggle with King Louis XIV and the usurped former King of England, James II. The Grand Alliance consisted of England and Scotland, led by the namesake of the war, William III of England, joined by the Dutch Republic, Holy Roman Empire, Spanish Empire, and Savoy. The North American front was an extension of the conflict in Europe, between England and France and their allied Native American tribes on either side. Each empire sought to gain control of the continent and dominate the lucrative fur trade in the area. This was known as the First French and Indian War, and no, I'm not referring to the French and Indian War. That was the final chapter of this series of 4 conflicts from 1754 to 1763. A bit confusing, I know, but let's not harp on it for too long. The colonists in New France and New England got little support from their mother countries during the war, so they relied more heavily on their native allies, with the Iroquois Confederacy supporting New England and the Wabanaki Confederacy supporting New France. The war waged from 1688 to 1697, with both sides failing to capture their main targets. New England had an unsuccessful campaign for Quebec, and New France had an unsuccessful one for Boston. As you might imagine, this resulted in a stalemate between the sides. In Europe, France was forced to give up some of its territorial gains during the war. The Treaty of Ridge-Switjik in 1697, ending King William's War, predictably didn't accomplish much, and really just set the stage for another future conflict to come soon after. That conflict arrived just over 4 years later. Queen Anne's War is the North American name for the War of Spanish Succession, and the second in the series of the 4 French and Indian Wars. The war was triggered by the death of Charles II of Spain, who was childless and gave his crown to the Duke of Anjou, Philip, a grandson of King Louis XIV of France. Louis proclaimed that France and Spain would be united under one crown, but England, Holland, Prussia, and Austria were not too happy about this. They formed a new Grand Alliance to combat France, seeking to make a distant Austrian relative of Charles, also named Charles, the King of Spain. The North American front of the war was much bigger in scope this time around, with New Spain joining the conflict along with their native allies. The French occupied the lower Mississippi Valley in 1699, along with their Choctaw and Chickasaw allies, which the English colony of Carolina viewed as a major threat. In 1702, a joint force of New France, New Spain, and their native allies unsuccessfully attacked what is now Charleston, South Carolina, officially beginning the North American front of the war. The Carolinas retaliated, and while the Southern front didn't result in significant border changes, it collapsed the indigenous population of the area, both in New Spain and the English colonies. There was also a northern front to the war, in a similar fashion to how most of King William's War was fought. This front was more successful for the English, who at this point in the video I should actually be calling the British, because the union between England and Scotland became official in the middle of this war in 1707, making them Great Britain. Britain provided military aid to their colonists in 1710, which allowed for the capture of French Acadia, which was renamed by the British to Nova Scotia, or New Scotland. In the end, Britain gained significant territorial assets not just in Europe but in North America as well. The Treaty of Utrecht was signed in 1713, which allowed King Louis XIV's grandson Philip to take the Spanish throne, but the Spanish Empire was partitioned to keep the balance of power, significantly weakening what was once one of the most powerful entities on the planet, and setting the stage for the British to ultimately fill that power vacuum years later. The main thing not addressed in the treaty was the concerns of the indigenous populations, which once again would set the stage for future conflicts. Dummers War was the direct result of the missing pieces of the Treaty of Utrecht. It was triggered by a border dispute between New England and the Wabanaki Confederacy in modern-day Maine and Nova Scotia. This is notably not considered one of the 4 French and Indian Wars, because while the French were allied with the Wabanakis, they were not active participants themselves. New England sought to expand their territory, led by Lieutenant Governor of Massachusetts William Dummer, the namesake of the war. Like I said, the Wabanaki Confederacy was allied with New France and primarily led by a French missionary named Sebastien Rale during the war. A common alternate name for the war is Father Rale's War. The New Englanders once again allied with the Mohawk during the conflict and were a contributing factor into their colonial expansion north into Maine. The Wabanaki were angered by this, and New England thought this was a great excuse to blame everything on the French and start yet another war. On July 25th, 1722, war was declared on the Wabanaki Confederacy, and for the next year, each side conducted a series of raids against the other, burning villages to the ground, killing innocents, and capturing women and children. In spring of 1724, Dummer ordered several communities in Maine to evacuate altogether due to the brutal raids that had been carried out the previous year. Things continued to look bad for New England in 1724, until the fateful Battle of Norridgewock on August 23rd. The battle began with Sebastien Rale killed by the New Englanders, and a good portion of the Wabanakis fleeing the scene out of fear. This allowed the New Englanders to burn the local farms and force those who had retreated to move even further north where they were more vulnerable. Several expeditions were made to finish what was started at Norridgewock, and by 1725, both sides sides had incurred significant losses, with the vast majority of lives being natives. On July 31st, 1725, Dummer announced hostilities would cease, and the treaty was finalized in the summer of 1727. This war didn't really accomplish much of anything. Sure, the British gained some of the territory in Maine that they wanted, but at the cost of many native lives and a general distrust towards the British from the remaining natives in the area. I shouldn't even have to mention at this point, this was far from the final conflict between the British colonists and the native tribes. This peace was only temporary. Remember the War of Spanish Succession that resulted in Queen Anne's War over North America? Well, switch around a few countries and monarchs and you've got the War of Austrian Succession that resulted in King George's War in North America. Charles VI, the Holy Roman Emperor, died in 1740 and was succeeded by his daughter, Maria Theresa, who was challenged by France, Prussia, Spain, and Bavaria, seeking to weaken the powerful Habsburg monarchy that dominated much of Central Europe. Maria Theresa was allied with Britain, the Dutch Republic, and Hanover, and when Prussia invaded the Austrian province of Silesia, a chain reaction was set off that plunged Europe into war for the next 8 years and involved nearly every nation on the continent. But this isn't a video about Europe. As you might have guessed, this war made its way to North America. It was named King George's War, not after King George III, who was the king during the American Revolution, but for his grandfather, King George II. This was the third of the 4 French and Indian Wars, and conflict started in North America in 1744 when the French attacked a British fishing port in Nova Scotia. New Englanders retaliated the next spring, with 4,000 troops laying siege to Fortress Louisbourg in Nova Scotia, a 6-week campaign that resulted in French defeat. The Wabanaki Confederacy was back, and more against the British colonies than ever, with frequent raids becoming a mainstay of the war, including a devastating attack on Saratoga, New York, which resulted in 30 deaths and 100 prisoners taken. Another consequential battle of the war took place in 1746, with a fighting force of 900 French colonists and their native allies taking Fort Massachusetts in Williamstown, a major military installation for New Englanders. Simultaneously to King George's War, the War of Jenkins Ear took place between Great Britain and Spain in the Caribbean, also considered to be an extension of the War of Austrian Succession. The vast majority of this war did not take place in what would later become the United States. There were smaller skirmishes in modern-day Florida and Georgia, which I thought deserved a mention in this section. Both wars ended on the European side with the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle on October 18, 1748, which called for all land, places, and possessions captured during the war to be returned to its original owners in North America, which strongly displeased the colonists on both sides. With an inconclusive end to the war, peace was unfortunately destined to only be temporary once again. The final major war that took place on American soil prior to the Declaration of Independence was, in a way, a culmination of all previous major conflicts on the continent. The French and Indian War is by far the most famous war I'll be talking about today, and was an extension of the global 7 Years' War. Winston Churchill once called the 7 Years' War the real First World War. And for good reason. It was one of the bloodiest conflicts of all time up until that point, and directly resulted in highly consequential events that in a way shaped the world that we know today. Alliances had shifted since the War of Austrian Succession, with France now allying with Austria and Britain now allying with Prussia, a reversal of the prior war. Echoing the beginning of the War of Austrian Succession, the 7 Years' War officially began with a Prussian invasion, this time of Saxony. The conflict quickly snowballed through a series of alliances and colonial loyalties, and soon became a global war on a scale which the world had never really seen before. I mean, just take a look at this map of who was involved. Anyways, focusing on the North American front of the war, the British and French were still pissed off at each other because of the undefined borders and the encouragement of their native allies to attack one another. In 1754, the Lieutenant Governor of Virginia ordered a young major to lead a party to assist in the construction of a fort in Pennsylvania. On the way, the party ambushed 35 French soldiers in what was known as the Battle of Jumonville Glen, the opening battle of the French and Indian War in North America. Who was that young major that led the attack, you might ask? Well, that was none other than George Washington. Yeah, George Washington kind of accidentally started a major front of a world war when he was just 21 years old. I'm not saying Washington should be specifically blamed for this. History is more complicated than one action having one direct consequence. Tensions were already extremely high at this time, and if it wasn't George Washington leading that party, it would have been someone else. And the 7 Years' War would have inevitably begun one way or another and made its way to North America. The French quickly retaliated against Washington and his men, driving them out of the region due to being outnumbered. In 1755, the British government sent General Edward Braddock over to the colonies to serve as commander-in-chief. But he didn't work too well with Native Americans and alienated many of their leaders and the colonial leaders as a result. He was mortally wounded in an ambush later that year, and the war was drawn to a stalemate in North America for the next 2 years. In 1758, however, the tide began to turn in favor of Great Britain. The British naval strength outclassed the French in every way, and by 1759, the British had conquered Canada, making it clear by this point that things weren't looking too great for the French. French. Despite a last-minute alliance between France and Spain, the British still succeeded in North America, gaining all French territory east of the Mississippi and Spanish Florida. The war ended in 1763 with the Treaty of Paris. No, not that one. Nope, not that one either. Still not that one. Nope, also wrong. Yeah, that Treaty of Paris. This treaty marked the true beginning of British global dominance, now that their main competition had been significantly weakened. However, while things looked good for the British on paper, a certain group of colonists weren't too happy with the heavy taxes placed on them to pay for the war. It's probably not too big of a deal. I doubt they'll declare independence from the British Crown or anything like that. So, there you have it. The major wars fought in what would become the United States prior to 1776. Of course, like I said earlier, this is not an exhaustive list. There were plenty, and I mean plenty, of smaller conflicts, mostly between settlers and Native Americans. I think it's interesting how, in a way, the wars I covered today kind of tell a linear story that eventually ends in the American Revolution. So let me know in the comments, do you think these wars are essential components of American history that should be taught more broadly? That's all I got for this time. Thank you for watching. This is Bay State History, signing off.